He buried his brother, outsmarted the FBI, and smiled through every verdict. But before the legend, before the empire, John Gotti was just a boy chasing fire the shadows of Queens. As the story begins, tell us where you're listening from and what time it is. If you enjoy the story, like the video and subscribe to support the channel. December 16th, 1985. It was just past 5:30 p.m. when the icy wind swept down East 46th Street in Midtown Manhattan, tugging at coats, flaring scarves, biting skin. The sidewalks were thick with the foot traffic of the seasoned stockbrokers leaving. Early tourists window shopping under Saks Christmas lights, deliverymen swearing under their breath, and then there was Sparks' Steakhouse. Glowing softly behind its glass windows, men in suits passed in and out, the kind of place where deals were made over porterhouse and Manhattans. But tonight the deal was death. A black Lincoln pulled up to the curb. From inside stepped Paul Castellano, the boss of bosses, 69 years old, neatly dressed, broad-shouldered, with a snow-white mop of hair and the slow, deliberate gait of a man used to being obeyed. With him was his bodyguard and underboss, Thomas Bellotti. Neither man carried a gun. They didn't need to. Castellano had ruled the Gambino family, the most powerful crime syndicate in America, with quiet menace and stone-fisted tradition. He was untouchable, or so he believed across the street. 4 men waited, 2 in trench coats, 1 in a peaked cap, 1 in a gray sedan. They weren't there for steak. The moment Castellano stepped toward the sidewalk, the gunman surged. 12 rounds were fired. In seconds, Castellano's body crumpled beside the car, his white hair blooming red across the sidewalk. Bellotti fell just beside him. Chaos erupted, diners screaming, drivers slamming on brakes, horns shrieking as bodies darted through the street. But the hitman melted away, absorbed into the city like steam from the manholes. News crews arrived within minutes. The NYPD cordoned off the scene with yellow tape and practiced apathy. But the whispers had already begun, passed between hands like poker chips. Gotti did it. John Gotti, the flashy capo from Queens, always in silk ties and 3-piece suits. He was bold, young, and hungry. And now he was something more. He was king. In the days that followed, New York held its breath. Castellano had been the commission-approved leader of the Gambino family, an old-school don who lived by the code. No drugs, no press, no noise. His assassination without permission was not just an internal matter, it was a declaration of war. Yet no war came. The other bosses from the Lucchese and Genovese families remained silent. They didn't condone it, but they understood the message, and the message was simple. The old way was dead. The new had arrived. John Gotti didn't hide. He didn't lower his head or issue statements from the shadows. Instead, he strolled down Mulberry Street in double-breasted coats, flashing smiles to reporters, waving to neighborhood kids like a politician on the trail. Days after the sparks hit, he was seen laughing at a holiday party at the Ravenite Social Club in Little Italy, glass in hand, a cigarette dancing between his fingers. The city had never seen a gangster like this, not since Capone. To the public, Gotti was electric. He wasn't the kind of man who had power. He wore it. His suits were custom-made at Brioni. His hair, a silver-black crown, was trimmed every 3 days. His walk had rhythm, not arrogance, but command. Every inch of him said, "I answer to no one," and yet behind the eyes was calculation. Years of waiting, of listening, of nodding when others talked, and only striking when the math was perfect. Gotti hadn't just killed a boss, he had eliminated a symbol and replaced it with a mirror the city couldn't stop staring into. Within weeks, the Gambino family reassembled itself. Old allegiances shifted. Young soldiers pledged fealty. Those loyal to Castellano either swore silence or disappeared into retirement. Their silence paid in fear. Gotti appointed Frank DeChico as underboss and elevated Sammy the Bull Gravano, a killer with the discipline of a soldier and the mind of a lawyer. The new regime wasn't just efficient, it was theatrical. At court appearances, Gotti would emerge like a movie star, flanked by bodyguards in sharp suits, his eyes hidden behind gold-rimmed sunglasses. He spoke politely to reporters, cracked jokes, and left judges speechless with his nerve. When charges came, and they always did, they failed to stick. Juries hesitated, witnesses vanished. The tabloids started calling him the Teflon Don. But before the Teflon, there was fire, and that fire began with Paul Castellano's fall. In the underworld, power isn't inherited, it's taken, with bullets, with blood, and with the confidence to never flinch when the world stares back. Gotti understood this in his bones. He wasn't born into luxury, he wasn't groomed for leadership. His rise was carved from the cracked streets of East New York, through hijackings at JFK, through beatings, through prison walls and courtrooms. By the time he reached 45, Gotti had already served time, buried friends, lost a brother, and survived enough betrayals to write his own code. And that code said, never bow, never wait, never. Let another man write your ending. Paul Castellano had waited, had bowed to the press, to lawyers, to caution, and so he fell, bleeding into the December slush. To Gotti, the hit was more than strategy. It was cleansing. Castellano represented the dying generation of mafia leadership, silent, aging, afraid of attention. He banned drug dealing, not because of ethics, but to protect himself. He refused to attend the funeral of Neil Delacruz, Gotti's mentor and the underboss of the family. Just 2 weeks before the Sparks assassination, in Gotti's eyes that wasn't oversight, it was betrayal. Delacruz had taught Gotti the rules of power, yes, but also when to break them, and Castellano, by forgetting his debts to the men below him, had broken the oldest rule of all, respect. Flows both ways. The Sparks hit wasn't just about ambition. It was about revenge. In the aftermath, as Gotti moved into leadership, he turned the Ravenite Social Club into a fortress. Every evening, captains came and went, slipping through the doors under cover of darkness. FBI vans parked outside daily, antennas raised, windows tinted, but inside, Gotti held court like a monarch, leaning back in a leather chair, sipping espresso, commanding loyalty with a glance. He wore diamonds in his pinky ring, but kept his voice calm. He greeted visitors with a handshake, then decided their fate by dessert. Some say he never raised his voice. Others say he never had to. Still, not everyone admired him. To the old families, Gotti was reckless, a peacock, too flashy, too loud, too American. The commission had long favored silence and longevity, and Gotti's headlines, magazine covers, and court appearances threatened the entire structure. But Gotti didn't care. He believed power should be seen. He saw no point in fear if it wasn't felt, no loyalty if it couldn't be tested, no leadership if it wasn't undeniable, so he leaned into the spotlight. Let the reporters come, let the agents listen. He wanted them to know his name, because to him a name that echoes is stronger than a name no one hears. Years later, when the indictments came, when betrayal struck, and prison doors clanged shut behind him, people would point to this moment at Sparks. They'd say this was when it all started. The night the old world was gunned down on the sidewalk, and a man with no crown, no permission, and no fear claimed the throne. They'd call it madness, they'd call it genius, they'd call it murder. But to John Gotti, it was the moment he stopped waiting. The man who wouldn't bow had taken the throne, and history had already begun writing his name. Before the suits, before the steakhouse, before the Ravenite Club and the headlines, there was a boy, small, wiry, quiet, a boy born into a world that offered him very little and asked far too much. October 27th, 1940, the South Bronx, John Joseph Gotti, Jr., entered a world already weighted by noise and hunger. His mother, Fanny, was a Brooklyn girl of Neapolitan blood, tough, devout, and endlessly exhausted. His father, John Joseph S.R., was a laborer when there was work and a ghost when there wasn't. The Gotti household would eventually swell to 13 children, crammed into narrow apartments that smelled of starch, sweat, and regret. The streets outside were loud with argument. Radios crackled from tenement windows. Sirens wailed like lullabies. In the Gotti home there was no such thing as quiet, only scarcity, only friction. In 1945, the family moved east first to East New York, then to Brownsville, and later to Howard Beach. The names changed. The struggle didn't. These were the forgotten corners of New York blocks of broken sidewalks and cracked brick, where hope came cheap and violence was cheaper. By age 9, John was already familiar with shame. He saw it in his father's slumped shoulders when rent was late, in the tension between his parents when bills outnumbered paychecks. But shame never sat well in John's chest. He wasn't built for surrender. He began to watch the men on the corner, sharp-dressed, cigar waving, laughing too loud and too free. They were gangsters, soldiers of the local mafia crew, and to John, they weren't criminals. They were escape routes. They wore suits while his father wore oil-stained denim. They rode Cadillacs while his mother cried over pawned rings. They were strong in a world that punished the weak, and John wanted what they had. He wanted to matter. By age 12, John Gotti had found his orbit. He ran errands for Carmine Faticos. Men carried packages from storefronts, whispered messages through payphones, and lingered at curbsides longer than most boys dared. He learned the code early. Don't ask. Don't tell. Don't ever flinch. School was an afterthought. At PS 67, he was restless, combative, suspicious of authority. He skipped classes often. Teachers called him difficult, but no one looked closer. At home, there was too little food and too much yelling. In class, there was too little patience. But on the street, there was clarity, clear lines, clear rules, and John liked rules, so long as he got to bend them. By 14, Gotti had found his tribe. He and his brothers formed a loose gang called the Fulton Rockaway Boys. They stole cars, shoplifted electronics, and shook down kids who crossed their turf. It wasn't organized crime, not yet, but it was a proving ground in this crucible of violence and hustle. Gotti began shaping the tools that would define him later. His glare, his pride, his belief in dominance. He punched fast. He never apologized. And he understood something most boys didn't. If people feared you, they couldn't ignore you. In 1956, at just 16, he dropped out of Franklin K. Lane High School. No ceremony, no applause. Just another boy walking out the doors and into the wind. He'd already made up his mind. The streets had better curriculum. And more importantly, they paid. He took on a job at a coat factory, another at a truck repair shop. The pay was meager, the hours long, but the real work, his real ambition, took place in the shadows. He kept running with Fatico's crew. More deliveries, more muscle. By 17, he was hijacking trucks from JFK Airport with boys who would one day be made men. The streets didn't care about age. They cared about nerve, and Gotti had plenty. But it wasn't just guts that set him apart. It was vision. Even as a teenager, Gotti understood image. He wore his hair slicked back in neat, calculated waves, pressed his shirts, shined his shoes. He moved with a sense of purpose, as if he already knew how the story would end. And maybe, deep down, he did. When you grow up in the shadows, you develop two choices. You can shrink, or you can burn. John chose fire. In the neighborhoods he haunted, mob presence was woven into the architecture. Social clubs stood next to bakeries. Bookmakers shared blocks with churches. The lines between legal and illegal weren't just blurred. They were erased completely. In Howard Beach, crime wasn't whispered. It was lived. Mothers scolded sons for disrespecting Mr. So-and-so, knowing full well that Mr. So-and-so might have bodies buried in the Pine Barrens. But that didn't matter. What mattered was bread on the table, protection from junkies, order in a world that otherwise offered none. And Gotti, even then, wasn't afraid of these men. He wanted to become them. He idolized names like Albert Anastasia and Carlo Gambino. Read about their histories, memorized their moves. He understood that violence had a language, but influence had a dialect of its own. Power wasn't just about killing. It was about making people believe you didn't have to. That lesson stayed with him by the late 1950s. John had already been arrested once for stealing copper wire, another for car theft. Neither stuck, but they were warnings, fragments of a pattern that was only deepening. In 1962, he married Victoria DiGiorgio, a quiet, steady woman, with little interest in crime but deep loyalty to John. They would go on to have 5 children, but even marriage couldn't soften the itch. Even fatherhood couldn't redirect the compass, because by then, John Gotti had already tasted control, and there was no going back. Behind his eyes lived a contradiction, fierce pride, mixed with volcanic insecurity. He hated being disrespected. He loathed being underestimated. Every slight, burned, every insult stayed folded inside him like a blade. That hunger to matter, to be feared, admired, remembered, was carved into him in childhood, not by trauma alone, but by the dull, grinding erosion of poverty, of watching his mother stretch leftovers, of watching his father beg for hours that never came, of knowing, even then, that men like his father would never change the world. But he would. He had to. And so, while other boys played stickball or flirted behind corner stores, John built himself into something else, not a thug, not a bully, a presence. He walked differently, talked differently. He didn't laugh too loudly, didn't speak unless he meant it. People took note. By his early 20s, he was already drawing attention from Fatico's upper ranks. They called him Black John, partly for his dark features, partly for his temper. He didn't tolerate disrespect. He didn't forgive slights. He would break a man's jaw one day and shake his hand the next, so long as the apology was clear. Howard Beach became his canvas. He knew every alley, every shortcut, every face. The ice cream shop where deals were whispered, the auto yard where favors were traded, the back lots where vendettas were handled without noise, and the neighborhood. It began to lean toward him. Mothers warned their sons not to cross him. Store owners gave discounts they couldn't afford. Priests nodded without asking why, not because Gotti was untouchable, not yet, but because they sensed what was coming. The boy had grown into a storm, and storms don't knock. They arrive looking back. The Gotti legend is often told in suits and sound bites, but the truth is less glamorous. It's rooted in hunger, in empty kitchens, in fists closed too early, and hearts hardened too young. Before the Ravenite Club, there were alleys. Before the headlines, there were whispers. Before the man, there was the boy who refused to be invisible. John Gotti didn't rise by chance. He rose because he refused not to. Because in the end, when you're born into the shadows of Queens, you either disappear or you make the city remember your name. There's a moment in every gangster's life when the street stops being a backdrop and becomes a battlefield. For John Gotti, That battlefield began at Kennedy Airport, under fluorescent lights and the roar of jet engines. He learned what it meant to move weight, steal silence, and make a name that others feared to speak too loudly. But before JFK, before the trucks and the furs and the cash, there was one door he had to walk through, and that door was Carmine Fatico. It was the early 1960s. New York was changing. The five families ruled the boroughs like invisible governments, carving up industries like pie, and in Ozone Park, Queens, one of those pieces belonged to Carmine Charlie Wagons Fatico, a quiet, ruthless captain in the Gambino family with a reputation for discretion and discipline. He didn't make headlines, he made money, and that made him dangerous. Fatico ran his crew out of the Bergen Hunt and Fish Club, a modest brick storefront on 101st Avenue, just a short walk from the shadow of the A train. Inside, hunters talked game and fish, while behind closed doors men counted envelopes full of protection cash and planned hijackings down to the second. This was where Gotti wanted in, not as a messenger, not as a kid, but as muscle. By 22, John was already known in Howard Beach, a brawler, a hothead, but also reliable. He never broke under pressure, never backed down from a fight. He handled small debts, small threats, small risks, all with a growing confidence that began to unsettle older men, and Fatico noticed. He brought Gotti closer, gave him bigger envelopes, bigger conversations, and then came the airport jobs. JFK wasn't just a hub for international travel, it was a cash machine every day. Cargo planes arrived with luxury goods, clothes, electronics, jewelry, pharmaceuticals, cash shipments bound for banks. And every day, someone looked the other way, a guard, a loader, a supervisor who knew better than to ask questions. It was the perfect system for organized theft, and Fatico's crew ran it like clockwork. Gotti's job was simple: organize the hijackings, make sure the trucks disappeared, and that nobody talked. But Gotti didn't just follow orders, he elevated the process. He moved like a tactician. He scheduled jobs when airport security was lightest. He used decoys dressed in uniforms, changed plates mid-ride. And when something went wrong, when a driver got spooked or a loader cracked, Gotti didn't hesitate to send a message. Sometimes that message came with a broken nose. Sometimes it didn't leave the warehouse alive. He earned a nickname, Johnny Boy. To outsiders, it sounded like a term of endearment. To those in the crew, it meant something sharper. The kid with no brakes, he liked the chaos, thrived on it. While other wise guys took their cuts and kept low, Gotti relished the risk. He'd ride shotgun on jobs he could have delegated, stand inside the warehouses to make sure no one skimmed extra. He didn't just want the reward, he needed the rush. But ambition is a razor, and in 1968 it slipped. One job, one mistake, and the system collapsed. The target was a truck filled with high-end electronics. Word came down that the load was sitting for 6 hours unguarded. Too tempting to ignore, Gotti organized a hit, but it moved too fast. A police informant tipped off authorities. As the truck pulled away from the lot, unmarked cars closed. And from every angle, screeching tires, screaming sirens, steel against steel, Gotti ran. For a moment, he almost made it. But the law doesn't chase slow. He was caught with the others. The charge: hijacking federal cargo. Conviction came fast. The sentence: 3 years in Lewisburg Federal Penitentiary. For most men, it would have been the end of a reputation. But for Gotti, it was his crucible. Lewisburg wasn't soft. It was filled with broken men and bitter time. But it was also filled with future players, mob soldiers from all 5 families, dealers, racketeers, old bosses who'd lost their edge but still held grudges like rosaries. Inside, Gotti didn't play the fool. He kept quiet. kept his clothes sharp, observed, waited, and what he saw changed him. He saw the weakness in men who once barked commands, the fragility of a name once the power faded. You saw what happened when loyalty dissolved. Who cracked, who betrayed. It wasn't just jail. It was a classroom in betrayal and survival. And Gotti studied everything. Back home, the crew kept moving without him, but Fatico remembered. He knew what he had in Gotti, not just a foot soldier, but something else, something harder to find, a man who didn't blink. When Gotti got out, he returned to the streets with a different walk, slower, heavier, less fire, more precision. Jail hadn't scared him, it had sharpened him. In 1970, Fatico promoted him, officially brought him deeper into the Gambino fold. Gotti was now overseeing key operations in Queens, hijackings, loan sharking, numbers, debt collection. He had 5 men under him, each one older than he was, and none dared challenge him. Not because of his fists, because of his certainty. He didn't waver, he didn't doubt. He made decisions with the cold speed of a surgeon, and cleaned up with the calm of a priest. The streets whispered louder now. Gotti was the guy who never snitched, the guy who stood up in court, the guy who took his time like a man and came back smarter. And with that he began to build his image, not just in cash and cuts, but in fear. He started showing up to meetings in tailored suits. Nothing flashy, not yet, but deliberate, crisp collars, Italian shoes. He trimmed his sideburns neatly, smoked slowly, made people wait to speak. Respect wasn't asked for. It was arranged. The crew began calling him something else, the true earner, because every job he ran, every corner he touched, brought results. He took 10%, then 15%. Soon, his envelope to Fatico was the fattest in the club. And when you make money in the mob, money protects you. But inside that quiet ascent was something volatile. John Gotti hated being seen as junior, hated answering to older men with less courage. He respected power, not tradition, and while he smiled in meetings, shook hands, and played the role, he was already thinking beyond the crew, thinking bigger, not just how to earn, but how to rule. At night, Gotti would walk alone through Howard Beach, coat collar raised, cigarette smoke trailing behind him like a veil. He didn't say much to the old-timers, didn't explain himself to the kids, but those who watched could feel it. He wasn't just climbing. He was measuring the city, the hierarchy, the cracks in it, the old bosses in their 70s fading into irrelevance, the sycophants, the weak, the safe players. Gotti didn't want to last long. He wanted to burn bright, to be unignorable. The airport jobs continued. The money grew. The name spread. But for Gotti, these years weren't just about getting rich. They were about crafting the beginning of a legacy, one built not in gold, but in blood, in respect, and in silence. A Bergen Hunt and Fish Club never made the papers, but inside something was changing. John Gotti, the dropout, the hijacker, the kid from East New York, had found his path, a path soaked in loyalty, violence, and careful ambition. The Fatico crew had given him a home, but Gotti was already looking for a kingdom, and he knew what it would cost to get there. Blood, time, and the refusal to kneel to anyone ever again. It was a quiet spring afternoon on 86th Street in Howard Beach, April 18, 1980. The pavement was warm, the trees had just begun to leaf, and the neighborhood felt like it always had, safe, ordinary, insulated. Children pedaled their bikes along the sidewalk. Mothers stood at porches in slippers, yelling dinner warnings through screened doors. Dogs barked in fenced yards. It was the kind of neighborhood where people knew who lived 2 doors down, where fences weren't about privacy but familiarity. And then came the sound, screeching, tires, a scream, and the clatter of a bicycle. crushed beneath the weight of a steel bumper. Frank Gotti, 12 years old, youngest of the Gotti children, was dead before his sister could reach him. The driver was John Favara, a neighbor, 40 years old, a warehouse worker, not a gangster, not a rival, a man coming home from work, half tired, half late, driving down a street he'd driven 1,000 times. The police called it an accident. No alcohol, no speeding, no intent, just bad timing. 1 second of distraction, a blind spot, a child cutting across the street too quickly. But in Howard Beach, there were no accidents. Not on that street, not with that name. John Gotti was in prison at the time, serving time in upstate Green Haven Correctional for an earlier hijacking charge. The news reached him behind concrete walls. The story was told plainly. Your brother, 12, hit by a neighbor, killed on impact. But nothing about the tone softened the truth. Not even in prison could he escape the shattering sound of it. For Gotti, family wasn't just sacred. It was a shield. And in that moment, it cracked. Frank was the youngest, the quietest, the one who still believed his big brother wore a cape. He liked baseball, model airplanes, and practicing his cursive until it curved perfectly across the page. He didn't belong to the streets. He belonged to the dinner table, the backyard, the space in a mother's heart that never quite closes again. When Gotti returned home for the funeral, the neighborhood watched in stillness. Men took off their caps. Women cried into tissues. And Gotti stood by the casket like a granite statue. He didn't blink, didn't speak, but something in him had shifted. John Favara, in his own way, was grieving too. He offered apologies, sent letters, left flowers. He was shaken, remorseful, but still present. And in Howard Beach, presence was a kind of provocation. A week later, graffiti appeared on his garage door. Murderer. A rock crashed through his window. His tires were slashed. Anonymous threats filled his answering machine. He thought about moving. He thought about staying. He hesitated, and in Howard Beach, hesitation is a final mistake. On July 28, 1984, months after the accident, John Favara disappeared. He was last seen leaving his workplace in New Hyde Park, Long Island. It was a normal summer day, sun glaring, asphalt shimmering. He walked toward his car, briefcase in hand, never made it. Witnesses later said a van pulled up beside him. 2 men jumped out. There was shouting, then the sound of metal, something like a pipe or a bat, and then silence. Favara was shoved into the van, the doors slammed, and he was gone. No body was found, no charges filed, no arrests made. He vanished like a shadow pulled under the earth. Rumors bloomed fast. Some said his body was dissolved in acid in a Brooklyn auto shop. Others claimed he was buried in concrete beneath a construction site in Queens. There was even a whisper, unproven, that his body had been placed inside a barrel and dropped in Jamaica Bay. But in all the noise, one message rang louder than the rest. Family is sacred. Violate it and vanish. Gotti, for his part, denied any involvement. In interviews, in court, in every inquiry that followed, he said the streets had their own way of interpreting justice. He shrugged off the accusations, smiled when the name was brought up. But those who knew him, really knew him, saw something. Behind the smile, a cold calculation, a justice system not bound by books or gavels, but by loyalty and vengeance. To Gotti, the police could rule the city, but the streets were his. And this wasn't about law. It was about equilibrium. Victoria Gotti, John's wife, had once attacked Favara with a baseball bat outside his home. Weeks after Frank's death, the police were called, no charges pressed, just grief, raw, red, and unfiltered. After Favara vanished, Victoria remained silent. So did the family, so did the streets. Because in neighborhoods like Howard Beach, Silence is thicker than blood, and secrets are honored like oaths. Years later, when Gotti stood trial for racketeering and murder, the name John Favara re-emerged. The press asked, the FBI prodded, but no witness ever surfaced. No one came forward. Not one voice dared to say, I saw. I know, I remember, because in Gotti's world, punishment didn't require confession, only certainty. And the certainty was this: if you caused pain to the Gotti bloodline, whether by accident or not, there was a price. What made the Favara disappearance different wasn't just its mystery, it was its clarity. This wasn't a mob war. This wasn't business. This was personal. A line drawn not in cash or turf, but in sorrow. And once it was crossed, there was no negotiation, no deals, no mercy, just erasure to some. It was monstrous, to others poetic, to the streets it was law. John Gotti didn't need to pull the trigger. He didn't need to swing the bat. He didn't need to drive the van. He only needed to exist, in silence, in legend, in the gravitational pull that made men act in his name. Years passed. The neighborhood changed. The kids grew up. The old shops were torn down. But the story of Frank Gotti and John Favara remained. It hovered in whispers, spoke through cracked sidewalks and aging porches, lingered in the way mothers held their children a little closer, and how, in certain houses, people still locked their doors before sundown. Frank Gotti never got to grow up, never got to wear a suit, never got to walk into the Berg Inn Club with his chin high. His name would never rise in the ranks, but his memory, it became a talisman, a reason, a trigger. And for John Gotti, who would go on to become the most feared and revered mafia boss in America, his brother's death carved a permanent scar, one that didn't weaken him but sharpened him. After 1980, Gotti didn't just command. He demanded. He didn't just earn respect, he enforced it. And when people asked how far he'd go to protect his name, the silence around John Favara's disappearance was answer enough. The steel doors slammed shut behind him. It wasn't the sound of justice. It was the sound of calculation, measured, final, indifferent. John Gotti was 32 years old, sentenced to 7 years in federal prison. The charge was murder, specifically the killing of James McBratney, a man suspected of kidnapping and extorting maid members of the Gambino family. Gotti had entered a Staten Island bar with 2 other men, posed as detectives, and botched the execution. McBratney fought back. There were witnesses. The arrest came quickly, and now Gotti was behind bars again. But this time it wasn't a stumble. It was a pause, a strategic retreat behind concrete walls. He was sent to the Greenhaven Correctional Facility in Stormville, New York, a medium security prison tucked in the frigid hills of Dutchess County, a place of metal bunks, flickering fluorescents, and long silences interrupted by sudden animal noise. Many men grew smaller inside those walls. John Gotti grew larger. He walked the yard like he still owned a piece of Queens. Not loud, not reckless, but studied, measured. Every nod was earned. Every glance held longer than it needed to, and slowly he built something few men could claim in prison: command. Gotti wasn't alone in Greenhaven. There were other wise guys, Genovese associates, Bonanno defectors, Lucchese soldiers doing short bids. Some had folded. Some still fantasized about the streets. But Gotti wasn't there to reminisce. He was there to observe. He watched how men broke. He studied how they hid weakness behind borrowed bravado, and he noticed the fault lines forming in the hierarchy. Outside, from the prison library, he followed court announcements and death notices in the daily news. He tracked indictments like a gambler watching the board. Bosses were aging. Loyalty was thinning. The commission had grown paranoid and stagnant. And back home, the Gambino family, his family, was starting to show cracks in the marble. Carlo. Gambino, the namesake and long-reigning boss, was getting older. He was respected, revered even, but he was losing touch. He kept his circles tight, his movements tighter, and when he died in 1976, everything shifted. The crown passed not to Aniello Dellacroce Gotti's mentor, and a street man to the core, but to Paul Castellano, a white-collar don, a man of silence and suits, one who believed racketeering was cleaner than blood. Gotti, from prison, saw the shift, and he didn't like what it meant. Castellano didn't come from the street. He wasn't known for fire or fists. He favored real estate deals, unions, construction rackets. He demanded obedience, not respect, and for street guys like Gotti, who had earned their place through risk and scars, Castellano's rise felt like betrayal. Inside the prison yard, Gotti began to plant seeds, subtle conversations, quiet dinners, plans not whispered but implied. The men around him, soldiers, associates, young earners, listened, and they didn't forget. Greenhaven became a kind of school, a place where Gotti taught his own curriculum. Power comes not from waiting, but from preparing. He didn't complain about the time. He used it. He wrote letters, dictated messages through visiting attorneys, and sent quiet signals through family connections. Every gesture was deliberate. Every message controlled. He reached out to men like Angelo Ruggiero, a trusted friend and fellow Queens native, to Sammy Gravano, a rising earner with cold eyes and reliable instincts, and to up-and-comers like Gene Gotti, his younger brother, who were already expanding their influence in Ozone Park. While Castellano held boardroom meetings in Staten Island mansions, Gotti's men shook down contractors in Brooklyn, ran narcotics through Queens, and collected debts without apology. They weren't subtle, but they were loyal. To him, the prison bars didn't dim that loyalty, they magnified it, because Gotti had done something rare in their world. He had taken a fall and kept his mouth shut. No deals, no snitching, no hesitation. He served the time, and that silence earned him something more valuable than freedom, mythology. By 1977, he was out, released early for good behavior. He stepped back into Queens, not as a soldier returning from war, but as a general arriving to reclaim his post. Things had changed. The neighborhood was quieter, colder, the streets more watched, the crews more cautious. But the moment Gotti walked into the Bergen Hunt and Fish Club, he didn't have to say a word. The room adjusted to him. He was no longer Johnny Boy. He was a man whose presence shifted the balance. Paul Castellano, now boss of the family, kept his distance. He didn't trust Gotti's style, thought him too loud, too impulsive. He preferred men who blended in, who wore restraint like cologne. But Gotti had no use for that kind of invisibility. He wasn't born to blend, he was born to ascend, and the younger generation agreed. The old world, the one ruled by cautious dawns and whispered protocol, was cracking. Men in their 20s and 30s didn't want patience. They wanted momentum, and Gotti offered it. He moved money fast, used muscle efficiently, respected the old ways, but only as far as they served the moment. He believed in results, not rituals. Within a year of release, he had turned his crew into one of the highest-earning factions in the Gambino family. He focused on hijackings, construction rackets, loan sharking, and eventually, despite Castellano's strict rules, drug distribution. He didn't advertise it, but he didn't hide it either. He knew the future was coming, and it was coming fast. But Gotti's most valuable asset wasn't money, it was memory. The names of those who had stepped up while he was away, the ones who'd stayed silent, the ones who'd slipped. He kept a ledger in his mind, who owed him, who feared him, who followed him, and slowly, piece by piece, he built an unofficial army. There were meetings in back rooms, drinks poured under dim lights. A nod from Gotti meant protection. A call from Gotti meant business, and Castellano, isolated in his mansion on Tot Hill, was becoming more and more like a figurehead. The power was shifting, not publicly, not yet, but in the alleys of Queens, in the corridors of federal prisons, in the minds of the next generation. The real boss was already walking among them, and Gotti knew it. He wasn't reckless. He was patient, but not patient in the way Castellano demanded. He was waiting not for permission, but for the perfect fracture, the moment when silence could no longer hold power together, the moment when the throne would wobble, and when it did, he'd already be standing behind it in prison. He had stared through wire and concrete and seen the blueprint of what was coming, and now, outside those walls, he was ready to build it, brick by bloody brick, smile by sharpened smile, a throne, not made of velvet, but of bone, loyalty, and silence. December 16th, 1985. New York City was wrapped in its holiday disguise, storefronts glowing with fake snow, carols looping through department speakers, and office workers filing out into the night with scotch on their breath, and end-of-year bonuses in their coat pockets. Midtown Manhattan glittered. But beneath the surface, beneath the neon and wreaths, something colder was moving. At 5:26 p.m., outside Sparks Steakhouse on East 46th Street, two men stepped from a black Lincoln. One wore a camel hair coat, the other, darker, heavier, stood by his side like a wall. Neither knew this was the last walk of their lives. Paul Castellano, boss of the Gambino crime family, was 69 years old. He walked carefully now, slowed by age but still proud. To many he wasn't a gangster. He was a CEO in silk. He had risen through the ranks not by bloodshed, but by influence, real estate, deals, union rackets, quiet, lucrative power. He held court from his mansion in Tot Hill, Staten Island, far from the noise of the streets. To some, he was a modernizer, to others a traitor to the old way. And now he was walking toward his favorite restaurant, unaware that the sidewalk in front of him had been chosen with purpose. John Gotti wasn't there. He was a few blocks away, watching from a warm car, radio humming softly, face unreadable. He had planned every detail. The timing, the lighting, the angles, and the men for and all dressed like businessmen, holding umbrellas, their weapons hidden beneath overcoats. When Castellano reached the curb, the shooters advanced. One shouted a name. Castellano turned. The first bullet struck his head. He collapsed into the sidewalk. Thomas Bilotti, his underboss and driver, was shot before he could draw a breath. The air cracked with gunfire, then went still. 12 rounds, 3 seconds, 2 dead. The shooters melted into the crowd. The city blinked. Blood pooled beside the curb. The scent of iron mixed with snow and exhaust. Holiday lights blinked just above it all, red. Green, red, again oblivious. Within minutes, the street filled with sirens. Photographers, reporters, onlookers stood in stunned silence. A mob boss had just been executed in broad daylight, on a Manhattan sidewalk with precision, with flair. It was something the city hadn't seen in decades, and everyone knew who was behind it. But no one said the name, not yet. Back in the Ravenite Social Club in Little Italy, the chairs were already being rearranged, cigarettes lit, phones picked up. The move had been made. John Gotti had committed the unthinkable. He'd killed the boss of the Gambino family, without commission approval, without ceremony. He'd violated the cardinal rule of La Cosa Nostra. You don't whack a boss without permission. But Gotti didn't ask. He calculated. He knew Castellano was vulnerable, despised by the street guys, distrusted by his own captains. A man who favored businessmen over made men, who prioritized profit over protocol, who banned narcotics while looking the other way when the envelopes arrived fat. And most importantly, he had failed to attend the funeral of Aniello Delacroce. had been Gotti's mentor, a street don, a man of fire and quiet code. He had held Gotti back for years, urging patience, honor, tradition. When Delacroix died of cancer on December 2nd, just 2 weeks before the sparks hit, Castellano skipped the funeral. He said it was to avoid FBI surveillance, but to Gotti, it was disrespect, worse weakness. In that moment, the decision was made. The plan wasn't universally accepted. It never is, but Gotti was persuasive. He moved in whispers and weight. He secured silent blessings from key capos Frank DeCicco, Sammy Gravano, Joe Armone, not endorsements, not signatures, but non-interference. And in this world, silence can sound a lot like consent. What followed the hit was not chaos. It was something more unsettling. Order, no retaliation, no war, no commission-sanctioned retribution. Within a week, it was done. Gotti was named boss. The Ravenite Social Club transformed overnight. No longer just a meeting spot, it became the unofficial seat of power for the new Gambino regime. Every evening, cars double-parked along Mulberry Street. Men in leather coats and slick hair stepped through the door without knocking. Inside, the air was thick with espresso and strategy. Gotti didn't sit behind desks. He sat in armchairs, relaxed, legs crossed, giving orders between bites of cannoli. He smiled more now, but the smile didn't soften him. If anything, it reminded people that behind it sat the man who'd ordered a public execution on a December sidewalk. FBI surveillance went into overdrive. Agents camped outside the Ravenite, tapped phones, zoomed lenses, but what they saw confounded them. There was no secrecy, no panic, just calm. A new king had taken the throne boldly, publicly, and nothing had happened to stop him. Gotti didn't just survive the violation of protocol. He thrived in it. To the older dons, he was reckless. To the street soldiers, he was righteous. And to the city, he became something else entirely. A celebrity. He wore $2,000 suits, had his hair cut every 3 days, spoke softly in interviews, smiled for reporters outside courtrooms. Fans gathered to catch a glimpse of him. He waved, he winked to the public. He wasn't a criminal, he was the outlaw king, someone who bent the system and looked good doing it. But the power came with risk. The commission watched closely. The FBI had never been more focused. Inside his own family, whispers grew. Men wondered if Gotti could take down Castellano. Who could take down Gotti? But for now, he was untouchable. He moved through New York like he belonged to it, not hiding, not hesitating. He dined at La Donna Rosa, held meetings at the Bergen Club, appeared at weddings with roses in his lapel and diamonds on his fingers, and the streets followed, because power, when seen, is more potent than when feared. But beneath the surface, something else was brewing. The FBI began listening, tapes rolled, friends were flipped, cases built like scaffolding in secret. Gotti's rise had been explosive, but explosions leave trails, and even kings cast shadows. Still, in the winter of 1985, none of that mattered yet. What mattered was this. A boss had been killed. His blood still stained the sidewalk outside Sparks, and in the vacuum, a man in a tailored overcoat had stepped in, not just to fill the space, but to own it. John Gotti didn't inherit the Gambino family. He took it, with bullets, with silence, and with a smile that told the world, "This is mine now." He stepped out of the black Lincoln slowly. The sidewalk was wet from a morning drizzle. But he didn't rush. The flashbulbs snapped like gunfire. Dozens of reporters clustered near the courthouse steps. Jostling for space, he adjusted the cuff of his Brioni suit, straightened the lapel, and smiled. John Gotti wasn't just entering court. He was walking onto a stage. By the late 1980s, he wasn't just a mob boss. He was a spectacle. While other dons ducked into shadows, Gotti leaned into the light. He wore Italian leather and camel hair coats like armor. Gold pinky rings glinted when he raised his hand to wave. Reporters called him the Dapper Dune, and the name stuck because in a city drowning in corruption, layoffs, and crack violence, here was a man who made crime look polished, composed, almost regal. He exited courtrooms like a movie star confident, unshaken, flanked by lawyers and bodyguards with sunglasses and silence. TV anchors announced his every step like it was royalty. Women sent letters to Rikers Island with lipstick on the envelopes. Barbers hung his photo beside Sinatra. Taxi drivers muttered his name like a spell. To many, he wasn't a criminal. He was a champion, the man who outsmarted the government, who beat the system in a suit. But beneath the flashbulbs and swagger, something else was tightening, paranoia. The walls were whispering, and Gotti could hear them. He began to suspect everyone. At the Ravenite Social Club on Mulberry Street, his de facto headquarters, he had the upstairs apartment rebuilt, soundproofed, insulated. Every meeting moved there. He refused to talk business on the ground floor, where agents in panel vans sat parked outside 24/7, antennas raised like silver blades. He developed a ritual. Speak with your eyes, trust your gut, and never say more than you have to. The rooms got smaller, the circles tighter. Loyalty became currency, and betrayal a death sentence. He changed phones constantly, rotated safe houses, met informants in diners, libraries, cemeteries, anywhere that couldn't be bugged. He stopped trusting even the men closest to him. If a soldier took a new girlfriend, Gotti asked questions. If a capo bought a new car, Gotti noticed too much. Money, too much talk, too many nods. These were signs, because he knew the truth better than anyone. The law never sleeps, and when they come with tapes. Still, the myth kept growing. He was seen dining at Raoul's in Soho, laughing into a glass of Chianti. He wore cologne that cost more than rent. His suits were pressed so sharply they looked stitched from tension. His hair, black, streaked with silver, was clipped every 3 days by a barber flown in from Bensonhurst. Gotti understood something few gangsters ever did. Style was power. Appear calm, and the world believes you are. Look expensive, and people will treat you like you're priceless. And in a city built on image, he'd perfected the performance. Court transcripts read like theater. Witnesses vanished. Juries wavered 3 times. Prosecutors brought him up on major charges 3 times. He walked out clean. The press dubbed him the Teflon Don, because nothing stuck. But inside Gotti's world, it wasn't magic. It was money. Jurors were bribed. Witnesses intimidated. Evidence misplaced. He had men in the unions, in the DA's office, in the NYPD. Every courtroom had a crack, and Gotti always found it. He didn't just control crime. He studied the system, learned its rhythms, watched its blind spots, and then he walked right through them. But with each victory, the stakes climbed. The FBI, humiliated, launched full surveillance campaigns. Agents monitored every phone call. Every conversation near the Ravenite was transcribed. They called it Operation Donnie Brasco. Part 2, an all-out attempt to prove the Mafia still had a heartbeat. And Gotti was the pulse in response. Gotti pulled even closer to his inner circle. Frank DeCicco, Joe Piney, Armoni, Sammy Gravano especially became invaluable. Cold, methodical, discreet, he was everything Gotti wasn't. Quiet, understated, invisible. Together, they ran the family like a corporation. The construction rackets thrived. They muscled into drywall unions, plumbing boards, concrete supply. Millions were siphoned from government projects, often with city officials turning blind eyes. If a contractor refused to pay, work would stop overnight. Bricks would go missing. Permits would get lost in drawers. The message was always the same: play ball or disappear. and they always played. Meanwhile, the drug money flowed through back alleys. Despite Castellano's old rule against narcotics, Gotti had allowed it quietly, efficiently. Coke, heroin, methadone, everything had a price, and the Gambinos collected it all. But the more he grew, the more he watched, not for cops, not for cameras, but for cracks. Because even a king knows he rules on borrowed time, Gotti would drive through Queens at night in silence. No entourage, just one soldier behind the wheel. He'd look at the storefronts, some he owned, some he didn't. He'd look at the lamp posts where kids once sold papers, the corners where men used to nod as he passed. Now they watched too carefully, spoke too softly, avoided eye contact altogether. Power was heavy, and he could feel it pressing down. At home in Howard Beach, things weren't better. His son, John Jr., was becoming a man curious, restless. Proud, there were questions. Should he follow the same path? Would he earn respect or inherit it? Gotti was torn. He wanted more for his son, but he also wanted a legacy, and legacies in his world are written in fear. The media kept circling. Books, movies, speculation. He's a modern-day Caesar. One article read, part gangster, part monarch. But they never saw the nights, the long walks, the men Gotti stared at too long. Before nodding goodbye, they never heard the silence. In the upstairs room of the Ravenite, or the way he'd sit for 20 minutes, saying nothing, just listening, measuring Gotti's brand, because by now it was a brand had become bigger than the man. He wasn't just a leader, he was a symbol, a reminder that crime could still outshine order, that fear could still walk with a smile, that the American dream had shadows, but every myth casts one, and behind Gotti, the shadows were gathering. Gravano was taking mental notes, the FBI tapes were mounting, prosecutors were sharpening their knives, and Gotti, somewhere deep down, knew they weren't afraid anymore. Not the law, not the rats, not even the streets. They were waiting. But until that day came, he would keep walking out of courtrooms like a king, keep wearing $2,000 suits, keep nodding to reporters, keep flashing that smile, cold, confident, iconic, because for John Gotti, image was the last defense, the only wall they couldn't wiretap, and as long as he looked untouchable, he was Howard Beach, Queens, 85th Street, just a few blocks from Cross Bay Boulevard, a neighborhood lined with neat lawns, brick homes, and white plastic fences that gleamed under the afternoon sun. It didn't look like power. It didn't look like a kingdom. But behind the curtains of 160 to 1185th Street sat a man who ruled the most powerful crime family in America. John Gotti didn't live in a mansion. He didn't need one. He understood something deeper than appearances. Power wasn't about size. It was about gravity. And wherever Gotti lived, that was where the center of the world was. His house was modest, a 2-story brick home with an iron railing and a small driveway, no bodyguards on the lawn, no cameras, just blinds that never tilted open. Inside, it was comfortable. Not extravagant, dark wood paneling, gold-framed photos of his children, a crucifix above the dining room. Victoria, his wife, kept the house quiet. John Jr. passed through in a hurry. But Gotti's presence hung over every room like smoke. Still, the real kingdom lay 12 miles away down the Brooklyn-Queens Expressway, across the Williamsburg Bridge, in the narrow streets of Little Italy, Mulberry Street, the Ravenite Social Club, a small gray storefront wedged between a bakery and a shoe shop. Its sign was faded, its windows frosted. To a passerby, it looked like nothing. To the FBI, it was the beating heart of the Gambino Empire. From the outside, the Ravenite looked silent. Inside, it buzzed. The front room was cramped, the carpet worn, the paint yellowed with time and cigarette smoke. Plastic chairs lined the walls. A coffee machine hissed beside a stack of racing forms. Men sat without speaking, watching the door. Some were soldiers, some were killers. All were listeners. Gotti never entered in a rush. He walked in late, dressed clean, head high, like he was stepping onto a movie set. When he arrived, conversations paused, not from fear, but from respect. The kind of pause that happens when the air shifts. When something larger enters the room, he would take the center chair under the wall-mounted TV. Frank DeChico would lean in. Sammy Gravano would nod from the corner, and slowly the day's business would begin. Not loudly, not directly. Everything was coded. No one used names. No one mentioned locations. If a deal was being made, it was called a favor. If a man needed to be dealt with, Gotti would simply raise a brow. If he nodded once, slowly everyone understood. He spoke in a low, gravel-toned voice. He wasn't theatrical. He didn't raise his voice unless he meant to cut. And when he laughed, which he did often, the room softened. He'd crack jokes with drivers, ask about a soldier's daughter, toss a 20 to the shoe-shine kid on the corner. He made people feel seen, but never too close, because in Gotti's world, warmth had edges. The FBI, of course, was always watching. By the late 80s, the Ravenite had been fully compromised. Bugs in the walls, cameras across the street, unmarked vans parked for hours, agents eating cold pizza in the dark, transcribing every syllable, but Gotti danced around them. He installed a wiretap-resistant room upstairs, an old apartment above the club, retrofitted with insulation and code. Words, if something serious needed to be said, that's where he'd go. Only the most trusted men were allowed inside, and even then, voices stayed low. To outsiders, it seemed like control. To those inside, it was something heavier, fear, because while Gotti smiled in public, he ruled with certainty, and that certainty was built on silence. If a man talked too much, he disappeared. If a captain went off script, he was replaced. Gotti didn't tolerate sloppiness, not in speech, not in dress, not in loyalty. Everything had to be tight, Sammy. Gravano would later say, he could charm you and destroy you in the same breath. Because that's what real power does. It confuses warmth for safety. Children in the neighborhood idolized him. He'd buy them ice cream, toss quarters onto stoops, ruffle their hair. They called him Mr. Gotti with the same awe they. Reserved for superheroes, he never cursed in front of women. He tipped in hundreds. He remembered names. But if your name appeared on the wrong list, that same man could vanish you in a blink. Inside the Ravenite, the hierarchy was invisible, but enforced. No one sat before he did. No one smoked unless he lit up. No one contradicted him unless they were ready to bleed. He could talk about football for an hour, then order a beating with a glance. The chessboard in the back room wasn't just for show. He played often with soldiers and capos. He preferred black. He liked the idea of countermove. The Ravenite wasn't just his headquarters, it was his temple, and everyone inside knew the commandments. Don't speak out of turn, don't whisper in corners, don't forget who made you. Still, Gotti wasn't cold. He celebrated birthdays, took care of widows, paid bail for soldiers without asking, but his kindness came at a cost. It bought loyalty, and loyalty bought silence. He hated weakness, couldn't stand excuses. If a man said, I tried, Gotti would cut him off. There is no try, he once said. You either do, or you don't walk back in. Behind the jokes, behind the laughter, everyone felt it. He was always watching. The Ravenite had a rhythm, coffee at noon, visitors at 2, serious business by 5, no cell phones, no notes. Just memory and menace, even. Law enforcement began to respect the choreography. They knew where he'd park, which side of the street he'd walk. Which jacket meant business. Which coat meant he was feeling generous. But they could never pin him because the real Gotti never stepped in front of a microphone. He lived in the space between conversations, in the silences that meant more than words. He ruled from two places, a modest brick home on 85th Street and a gray-walled room on Mulberry, and from those 2 points, he ran a criminal empire worth hundreds of millions: construction, garbage hauling, nightclubs, union pensions, bookmaking, extortion. Every envelope passed through someone's hand who eventually answered to him. He didn't need to yell. He didn't need to threaten. His presence was the sentence. To walk into the Ravenite was to walk into a court without law. There were no gavels, no robes, just a man in a tailored suit, sipping espresso, deciding fates, and everyone knew if you left that room with his blessing, you were safe. If you didn't, you might not leave at all. And in the movies, bosses live in castles. But Gotti didn't need walls. He didn't need gates. He had something stronger, respect enforced by fear, fear masked as charm, charm sharpened into silence. His home was just brick, his club just plaster, but make no mistake, there were thrones, and from them, John Gotti built a reign not written in ink, but in breathless whispers, and the quiet shuffle of chairs. As men waited for him to speak, the cameras were already waiting when he stepped out. Mid-morning sun, sharp shadows on the courthouse steps. He wore a dark navy overcoat, gray silk scarf, and a Brioni suit so perfectly cut it looked stitched. From silence the crowd parted, reporters surged, microphones were lifted like weapons. But John Gotti didn't flinch. He lit a cigarette, flashed a grin, and walked through the chaos like it belonged to him. It was 1986, the first of 3 major trials, and the beginning of what would become known as the Teflon years. The charge was assault and conspiracy. The government claimed Gotti had ordered the beatings of union officials who refused to play ball. They had testimony, phone records, eyewitnesses. What they didn't have was a conviction inside the courtroom. Gotti was composed, cooler than the lawyers, more polished than the judge. He leaned back in his chair, arms folded, as if he were watching a performance he'd seen before. When the prosecution pressed its case, he smirked. When witnesses stumbled, he nodded faintly, as if affirming what he already knew. They had nothing. The jury deliberated for 2 days. The verdict: not guilty. Gotti walked out of court with a slow, deliberate stride. Cameras flashed. One reporter shouted, "Any comment, Mr. Gotti?" He paused, exhaled smoke, and said, "Just another day." But behind the scenes, federal prosecutors were furious. This wasn't justice, it was humiliation. The tapes had been clear, the threats provable, the motive obvious. Still, the jury had blinked. Why? Whispers spread, a juror with a gambling debt, a neighbor too afraid to sleep at night, a witness whose memory had suddenly gone foggy. No evidence, no proof, just shadows. And in the courtroom, shadows were enough. The FBI regrouped. New wiretaps, new agents, new informants. They shifted focus. Gotti was the prize, yes. But perhaps the key to cracking him sat just 1 chair away. Salvatore, Sammy the Bull, Gravano, Underboss, loyal lieutenant. Stone-eyed, soft-spoken, a man who preferred silence to ceremony to the outside world. Gravano was invisible, but inside the Gambino family, he was the architect. He ran the construction rackets, the unions, the docks. He made money mountains of it and delivered it upward without complaint. Gotti trusted him, relied on him, but the Bureau watched him because if Gotti was the face, Sammy was the hands. Still, Gotti's confidence was unshaken. He moved through New York like it was his name carved into the sidewalks. In 1987, the second trial came. Racketeering, extortion, conspiracy, same theater, same actors, same result. Not guilty. By now, the nickname had changed. No longer just the Dapper Don, he was now the Teflon Don. Because nothing stuck, and the media, they loved it. TV anchors said his name with reverence. Tabloids printed his face beside headlines meant for rock stars. He smiled for the cameras, waved to fans, signed autographs outside the Ravenite. To the public, he wasn't a criminal. He was a man who had beat the government twice, and looked good doing it. But inside the Ravenite, something was shifting. Gotti's moods darkened. His meetings grew shorter, his questions more pointed. He didn't like whispers, he didn't like caution. He wanted loyalty, absolute, immediate. Anything less was betrayal. And still, the FBI kept digging. They recorded him in the upstairs room at the Ravenite. 3 times a week, for months, hours of audio. Most useless coded language, grunts, disguised commands, but sometimes a slip. A name, a price. A pause that carried weight. They were building something. Not a case, a trap. Then came trial number 3. The biggest yet, federal racketeering. 5 murders, loan sharking, illegal gambling, tax evasion. This time, the prosecution was ready. They had tapes. They had years of surveillance. And they had momentum. But Gotti was still Gotti. He walked into the courtroom like it was Sunday Mass. Same suit, same grin, same posture. And again, the verdict came. Not guilty, the courtroom gasped. Reporters scrambled to rewrite their headlines. The FBI was stunned. 3 trials, 3 acquittals. Dozens of charges evaporated in sunlight. He was untouchable. A living contradiction. A man who walked the line between myth and menace and made both work in his favor. But even legends have fault lines, and the FBI knew where to press. They turned up the heat on Gravano, picked apart his deals, targeted his family, painted him as vulnerable, isolated, disposable. They played him tapes, secret recordings from the Ravenite, recordings where Gotti questioned his judgment, mocked his power, even hinted at turning him over if things got rough. And something inside Sammy the Bull shifted. He had killed for Gotti, bled for him, buried friends for him. But now, the man he had followed without question was preparing to feed him to the wolves. In late 1991, Gravano flipped. He sat with federal prosecutors in a quiet room and began to speak. Names, dates, contracts, murders. He laid out the entire Gambino structure and Gotti's role at the top. It was the single most devastating betrayal in modern organized crime. The Teflon was cracking, and underneath it blood. The press didn't know yet. The city still clung to the image of Gotti as the untouchable king, the man who danced past justice. But behind closed doors, a case was being assembled that would finally stick. Because every Don has a weakness, and Gotti's wasn't the government. It was trust. He trusted Gravano, believed silence could be bought with loyalty. But silence, it turned out, was more fragile than fame. And in a world ruled by whispers, one voice, speaking in the right room, was enough to bring down a kingdom. It started with a whisper, just one man in a locked federal room, sitting beneath fluorescent lights, no lawyers, no soldiers, no code to protect him, just Salvatore Gravano, a file on the table, and the weight of 17 years in organized crime pressing down on his back. He was stone-faced at first, the way they remembered him, Sammy the Bull, loyal, silent, deadly. The man who had run the Gambino family's operations with machine-like precision. But something had changed. His name was now written in a different ink, defendant, and the walls were getting closer. The FBI had tapes, dozens of them, recordings from the Ravenite Club, from payphones, from bugged cars and bent conversations. On those tapes, John Gotti didn't sound like a king. He sounded like a man giving orders, cold ones, murder contracts, price discussions, evaluations of who should live and who had outlived their use. At first, Gravano didn't react. He heard himself mentioned, talked about like furniture. He heard Gotti question his loyalty, his decisions. He heard laughter in places where silence used to live. And something inside him cracked. Gravano had always been loyal, not out of fear but out of structure. There were rules, he believed, lines you didn't cross, and in his mind, he hadn't. He had buried bodies, ordered killings, protected secrets, built fortunes, all for the man he sat beside shoulder to shoulder in courtrooms, mile after mile in silence. But now, in that sterile government room, the truth played back to him on tape, and John Gotti's voice, the voice of the man who once made him Underboss, sounded distant, dismissive, prepared to let him take the fall. On the surface, Gotti remained composed, even when he heard that Gravano had agreed to cooperate. Even when the headlines screamed betrayal, he brushed off reporters with a grin, smiled for cameras, shook his lawyer's hand like nothing had changed. But inside he knew the game was over. Gravano had killed 19 men, some with his own hands, some with the flick of a command. Now he was naming them, describing the methods, the motives, the voices in the room when the hits were planned. And at the center of those rooms, he said, was John Gotti. It wasn't just testimony, it was a blueprint. He gave them roots, timelines, names. He drew the family tree from memory. One by one, the roots were traced, and every branch pointed back to Gotti. The betrayal echoed, not just in court, but in the neighborhoods, the clubs, the prison yards. Because Sammy the Bull wasn't just anyone. He was Gotti's right hand, and when the right hand turns, nothing is sacred. The media went wild. Papers printed Gravano's mugshot beside Gotti's. Like twin portraits of a falling empire, reporters called it the biggest flip in mob history. Prosecutors called it unprecedented, and in court, when Gravano took the stand, everything stopped. The courtroom was silent. Gotti sat still, suit perfect, jaw set. He didn't look at Sammy, didn't blink. Gravano spoke for hours, days. He told them about the Castellano hit, about bodies in shallow graves, about bagmen, codes, the structure of the family, the meetings, the voice of Gotti saying, "Take him out." The jurors watched. They heard the tapes. They listened to the rhythm of truth. Slow, measured, devastating. The government had finally done what they couldn't do for nearly a decade. They had punctured the myth. Gotti's image was armor, designer suits, silk ties, a smile in the face of indictment. But now that smile looked different. Not charming, not confident, cornered. Gravano's words did what bullets and wiretaps never could. They stripped Gotti of his legend. The jurors didn't just see a boss. They saw a man who ordered murders like appointments. A man who talked about friends like liabilities. A man who wore silence like silk, but tore it off in private. In the days that followed, the Gambino family fractured. Some men disappeared. Others were picked up in sweeps. Loyalty was no longer a currency. It was a liability. Gotti's empire, once ironclad, began to rust. The Ravenite Club was shuttered, the phones disconnected, the coffee pot cold, back in court, the trial ground forward. The jury sat stone-faced. The evidence was a tide, every tape, every word, every admission, a nail in the coffin. And through it all, Gotti remained expressionless. He didn't flinch, didn't yell, didn't plead, even when Gravano pointed directly at him. Even when he said he gave the order, Gotti sat like marble, unmoving, because even as his empire collapsed, he would not fold. To fold would be to die. He had built a legend, not just of power, but of poise. He would lose in style. He would fall with posture. No matter what was said, no matter how deep the knives twisted, he would never show pain, but make no mistake. He felt it. Sammy was more than a partner. He was insurance, structure, the machine that kept the kingdom running. And when that machine turned, the lights went out. Sammy Gravano was sentenced to 5 years for 19 murders. A deal, a reward, a symbol of how far things had fallen. And when the sentence came down for Gotti life without parole, the courtroom barely breathed. It wasn't just a man being sentenced. It was the end of an era. Outside, the city buzzed. Some cheered, some mourned, some lit candles because, for all he had done, John Gotti had meant something to his enemies. He was menace to the streets. He was myth to history. He was contradiction. And behind that contradiction stood one final truth. Even kings fall, not always by swords, sometimes by whispers. It was a gray morning in Brooklyn, March 1992. Not the kind of cold that bites, but the kind that lingers, damp, weightless, quiet. Reporters huddled behind barricades. Federal agents stood with arms crossed, scanning the sidewalk. And then the door opened. A man stepped out, wearing a tailored charcoal suit, a crisp white shirt, and the same calm expression he'd worn for years. John Gotti didn't look like a man facing the trial of his life. He looked like he was attending a matinee inside the federal courthouse. The air was still, not tense, not frantic, just heavy. This wasn't Gotti's first trial, but everyone in the room knew this one was different. The government had waited a decade for this. They'd failed 3 times, but this time they had everything. They had Sammy Gravano, they had tapes, they had names, places, bodies, and voices. There would be no theatrical acquittal, no swaggering exit down the steps, no cigar lit behind. The limousine door, this was the reckoning. Gotti sat at the defense table, quiet, hands folded. To the cameras, he was still the dapper Don, immaculate, upright, unbothered. But inside the courtroom, the mask had begun to tighten. The prosecutors wasted no time. They opened with names of the dead: Paul Castellano, Robert DeBernardo, Louis Di Bono, Eddie Lino, Thomas Pilati. They weren't just victims, they were pieces in a puzzle, and every piece pointed to one man, John Gotti, the star witness of. Course was Gravano, seated just feet from Gotti, once his shadow, now his executioner. He spoke with a steady voice, clipped and deliberate. He didn't embellish, he didn't waver. He detailed the Castellano hit like he was describing weather. He described meetings at the Ravenite, discussed orders handed down in silence, told the jury about the hierarchy, the payouts, the rules, explained how Gotti would decide who lived, who died, and how the bodies would vanish. 19 murders, 19 decisions, 19 ghosts sitting quietly between them. The jury listened. Gravano painted the empire not as a myth, but as a machine, one with gears, levers, names, addresses, and at the center of that machine, Gotti. The tapes only reinforced it, grainy. Audio, voices behind static, but unmistakable. You do what you gotta do. Make him disappear. He don't listen, he don't eat. These weren't just throwaway lines. They were orders, commands, the language of a man who ran death like a business. The defense tried to spin it. They attacked Gravano's credibility, called him a liar, a turncoat, said he was saving his own skin, but the damage had been done. The jurors watched Gotti sit in silence, his once theatrical confidence now tightened into stillness. No grins, no smirks, only a man watching his kingdom crumble. Outside, the cameras kept rolling. The headlines screamed, "Gotti on the ropes." Sammy unloads, the Don exposed. Inside, the prosecution rested, and for the first time, Gotti didn't rise from his seat like he had somewhere better to be. He simply remained still, like a man beginning to understand the finality of things. The jury deliberated for 14 hours over 2 days, no confusion, no delay. On April 2nd, 1992, they returned guilty On all counts, 5 murders, conspiracy, racketeering, the judge didn't raise his voice, didn't lean in. He simply spoke the sentence. Life without parole. Gotti didn't flinch. He didn't yell, didn't speak. He straightened his cuff and nodded once slowly, not in acknowledgement, but in defiance, because if there was one thing he had left, it was posture. They let him out in cuffs. No smile this time, no fans, no fanfare, just the sound of footsteps. Echoing down the hall, the door closed behind him. And for the first time in decades, John Gotti vanished from New York. The myth was over, the suits, the smiles, the silk ties folded into memory. What remained was a man behind bars, not in shadow, but in concrete, real, contained. The Teflon had worn off, and underneath it was just a man. There are prisons, and then there is Marion, built to replace Alcatraz. Marion Penitentiary in Illinois wasn't just a place for the convicted. It was where the system set the unbreakable. The men too dangerous, too defiant, too legendary to mingle with the rest. When the door slammed shut behind John Gotti in 1992, it wasn't just steel meeting steel. It was the echo of a dynasty collapsing under its own weight. This was not Rikers, not a holding pen for the temporarily inconvenienced. This was 23-hour lockdown. No yard, no phone calls, no contact, no suits, no press, no throne, just silence, a cell, a slot in the door for food, and the sound of your own breath, hour after hour, day after day. For a man like Gotti, who fed on attention, thrived on control, and treated the streets of New York as his personal chessboard, this wasn't just confinement, it was erasure. Still, in those first months, he resisted the void. He sent messages out, cleverly coded, through lawyer visits, each phrase chosen like a secret handshake, a nod, a number, a phrase from a movie. He was still trying to run the Gambino family from a concrete tomb 900 miles from Brooklyn. And for a time he did. Orders still flowed, favors still owed. Messages traveled like blood through veins, slow but alive, but something began to crack. In the silence, in the routine, in the fluorescent lights that never dimmed. Isolation wasn't an event, it was erosion. One day, it was a missed meal, then a forgotten face, then a name he didn't bother saying anymore. The walls didn't bend, but Gotti did. Outside, the world moved on. The Ravenite Social Club, once a temple of whispers and rituals, now sat empty, a dusty storefront with no gods left to worship. The tabloids moved on to newer names, lesser crimes, and inside Marion, Gotti aged. His hair lost its jet-black shine. His posture softened. His voice, once sharp as broken glass, dulled at the edges. And then came 1998, a cough that didn't go away, a sore throat that tightened like a noose. The tests came back. Throat cancer, stage 3. Even for a man who made death routine, the diagnosis held weight, not just because it meant the end, but because of how it would come. Not in a hail of bullets, not in a betrayal, not in the back of a car or on the floor of a club, but slowly, quietly, dissolving inch by inch behind a door no one would open for him. They moved him to the medical unit. The doctors did what they could, radiation, medications, but by 2000 it was clear the disease had spread. Into the jaw, into the voice box, into the bones. He stopped eating. Letters stopped. The family stopped trying to push orders through. The Gambino throne shifted without ceremony. A man named Peter Gotti would wear the crown, but it no longer glittered in his final months. Gotti sat in a prison hospital bed, his jaw partially removed, unable to speak. Fed through a tube, he had once been the face of American crime, a man who smiled for cameras after trials, who dined at the best restaurants while being hunted by the FBI, who made the streets of New York kneel. Now he was pale, with sunken eyes and paper-thin skin. His room was sterile, the walls white, the geo air recycled and still, the kind of place where memory dies quickly. They allowed his son a final visit. John Jr. sat beside him, trying to find the man he remembered, the one with sharp suits and sharper orders, the one who made enemies disappear and made loyalty feel like religion. But the man in the bed was fading. He nodded, tried to gesture, but the words were gone. A king without a court, a general without a war, a father with nothing left to command. On June 10, 2002, at 1 a.m., John Joseph Gotti Jr. died of cancer at the United States Medical Center for Federal Prisoners in Springfield, Missouri. He was 61 years old. The funeral would be small. By his standards, the media were kept back. There were no white horses, no brass bands, no Sinatra, just a coffin, a plot in St. John's Cemetery, Queens, where Castellano was buried. Where the past refused to rest quietly, they buried him in a suit, not because he asked for it, because it was all that was left of the myth, the Dapper Don, the Teflon Don, the man who once walked through bullets and indictments as if they were mist, now lowered into earth. No cameras, no fanfare, just a handful of mourners and the quiet inn. The end. Gotti got what most gangsters never live long enough to receive. Time. Time to decay. Time to reflect. Time to become something no one expected. Mortal. He had chased legacy like a man chasing fire, and for a time he held it. But fire does not stay in the hands that grasp it. It burns, it moves, it leaves behind only smoke and silence, and stories told in whispers long after the lights go out. June 14, 2002. 4 days after John Gotti's death, the streets of Howard Beach, Queens, did not mourn quietly. They lined up early, dressed in dark coats and solemn expressions, standing under a thick gray sky. Some brought flowers, others brought memory. The white carriage rolled slowly past the storefronts, pulled by a team of snow-colored horses. Their manes brushed smooth. The coffin inside gleamed, cherry wood and brass, polished until it reflected the rain clouds. Beneath it all, beneath the metal and ritual, lay a man who once made the world bow, and would now return to it. St. John's Cemetery had seen many like him, men with sealed files and closed mouths, but few with a name that carried weight like this. Gotti, John Joseph Gotti Jr., born October 27, 1940, died June 10, 2002. A father, a boss, a myth. The government tried to make it quiet. Federal authorities discouraged the spectacle. No helicopters, no fanfare, no grand procession. But the people came anyway. Not all were family, not all were friends, but all had looked at him at some point and seen something more than just a gangster. To some, he was the villain. To others, a kind of outlaw saint, who wore silk, shook hands like a senator, and stared down the law with a grin. They say the Bronx gave him grit, Brooklyn gave him edge, but Queens gave him loyalty, and loyalty in his world was a kind of religion. Men don't get remembered for the charges on their sheet. They get remembered for how they walked into the courtroom, how they carried silence like a sword, how they kept their suits pressed even when the world wanted to see them crumble. The funeral was part procession, part pilgrimage. Old-timers from Ozone Park came in black Cadillacs. Younger men who'd only heard the stories arrived in silence, unsure whether they were honoring a man or the idea of one. They say over 2,000 people watched the casket pass. Locals left roses on the sidewalk. Mothers whispered the name to their sons like it belonged to another era. He was buried near the others. Paul Castellano, Aniello Delacroce. A plot among legends, a reminder that in the end, no throne outruns the dirt. But death didn't end the myth. It sealed it. Hollywood came next, so did the books, the documentaries. The interviews with men who once sat at his table or feared to. Producers dug through trial footage. Writers praised his fashion, his boldness, his defiance. Television hosts turned his mugshot into a symbol, even as the facts blurred. The image held John Gotti in that immaculate three-piece suit, walking through a sea of cameras like a movie star. The dapper Doan, untouchable, unbent, but behind the shine there was always contradiction. He protected his family. He endangered them. He demanded silence. He became the most public face organized crime had ever known. He killed without hesitation. He smiled without regret. He died in prison. But in memory he lives outside, on the corner of Mulberry Street, in the echo of leather shoes on marble floors, and the hushed reverence of men who still call him the boss. John Gotti didn't build the mafia. He wasn't the first to run a family. He wasn't even the last to stand trial, but he became the face of something older than law, the image of power that dressed well, talked smooth, and never blinked. For some, he was the end of an era. For others, the beginning of legend. Either way, the myth walks on. There's something heavier than inheritance, something colder than money. It's the weight of a name, John Angelo Gotti, son of the most famous gangster since Capone. Never asked to be royalty, but in the world he came from, blood was destiny, and his last name was both crown and curse. They called him Junior, but there was nothing small about the shadow he stepped into from the moment he took his seat at the table in the 1990s. It was clear the world expected another Gotti, another king, but the world had changed, and Junior wasn't his father. He dressed well. He spoke carefully. He made his move through familiar corridors. Howard Beach, Staten Island, the same. Restaurants, the same rituals, but loyalty had thinned, respect had splintered. Gone were the days when a Doan could stroll Mulberry Street like a mayor. The FBI had grown sharper. So had the cameras, and the men around him, once governed by silence, had learned how to bargain. By the late 90s, Junior was facing what his father once seemed immune to. Indictments. Federal prosecutors accused him of everything from racketeering to extortion. Witnesses flipped, details spilled. The trials came, one after another, 1999, 2005, 2006, in each courtroom. Reporters leaned forward, searching for the fire of his father, the steel spine, the smirk under pressure. But Junior didn't smirk. He sat in silence, not regal, not invincible. Just a man trying not to drown in a legacy too large to carry. Eventually, the government gave up. The final trial ended in a hung jury. Junior walked free, but not unchanged. In 2010, he told the world he was done. Done with that life, done with that name. The Gambino family didn't die, but it bled, slowly, quietly. After Gotti, the leadership passed hands. But the glory never returned. No more headlines, no more fireworks. Just transactions in the dark, anonymous, efficient, forgettable. The mafia hadn't ended, but the era of the celebrity gangster had, and yet. Gotti lived on, not in courtrooms or council meetings, but in music videos, in rap lyrics, in high-end suits with peak lapels and pocket squares, in colognes named after power, and tattoos that inked loyalty across ribs and backs. He became metaphor. He became icon to some. He stood for defiance. To others for discipline. But mostly, he stood for a time when power wore a smile and bullets were just punctuation. There are those who say Junior tried to honor his father, and those who say he ran from him. Both might be true, because in the end, the Gotti name isn't just history. It's prophecy. It tells young men they can be feared if they walk right, talk low, and never blink. It tells sons they must become fathers or be devoured by them. It tells the world that even when the man is gone, the myth stays suited, grinning, and undefeated. What does a man leave behind when the lights go out? For John Gotti, it wasn't peace, it wasn't mercy. It was legend, meticulously built, ruthlessly defended, and ultimately what buried him. He could have been quiet, like the Genoveses. He could have operated in the shadows, spoken softly, dressed plainly, avoided cameras, but that was never his nature. Gotti didn't want survival. He wanted permanence, in every flashbulb, in every newspaper cover, in every whispered name on a street corner. He sought something bigger than the life itself. Not just power, not just fear, immortality. He wore it in silk and gold. He smiled through indictments. He waved from behind bars, not because he was untouchable, but because he wanted to be unforgettable. He was a Don in the age of satellites, a gangster who dared to become icon. And it worked, but it cost everything, because fame has no loyalty. The suits faded, the smiles dimmed, the loyalty cracked, the silence broke, and in the end all that remained was a man in a hospital room, gaunt, voiceless, alone, no cameras, no admirers, just the hum of machines and the echo of a name once too loud for its own good. Could he have lived longer? Could he have died richer, freer, with grandchildren on his knee? Maybe, but Gotti didn't want a quiet life. He wanted a loud legacy, and he got it. Now his name lives where real men can't follow, in movies, in lyrics, in shadows. The streets remember, but not kindly, not clearly, just loudly fame gave. Him legend, but legend is a lonely crown, and in the end, it was the only thing left on his head.